I, David Cohen Vinton,
do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that my testimony
that's my testimony
that I've come to give
that I've come to give
to the TRC of Liberia
to the TRC of Liberia
is the
is the
truth
truth
and nothing but the whole truth.
and nothing but the whole truth.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Please be seated.
Good afternoon, sir. On behalf of the Commission, we want to welcome you to this segment of our thematic hearings on economic crimes and to thank you for accepting our invitation to come and share your experience with us, your perspectives, and perhaps advance some recommendations which will help to improve our regime meant to control or mitigate economic crimes. As you know, the TRC is an offshoot of the Accra Peace Agreement. And under the TRC Act, we are mandated to establish the root causes of the conflict and trace those causes to the effects and underscore the motives, the patterns, and how come it was possible that for more than a decade we fought a bitter civil war in our country. The perpetration of economic crimes has been identified as one of those motives that have led to chaos, conflict, and then war. In other instances, the proceeds of economic crimes were directly used to propagate the war. You have an experience that goes back to perhaps the late 70s in our economic sector, at one time a governor of the National Bank. And because we believe in hearing from resource persons, in gathering first-hand information, we thought it would be useful if you could come and share your experience with us on aspects of the economy that tend to manifest wrongdoings in the financial sector as it relates to bank closures and other issues that you have identified to be addressed. So I want to thank you very much for accepting this invitation, for being here today. We say welcome again, sir. Please, before you proceed, please allow me to introduce commissioners. Commissioner Umu Sila sits at my right. Commissioner Gerald Coleman at my immediate left. Commissioner John Stewart, and Commissioner Massa Washington, who will join us during the course of your deliberation. Thank you, sir, and you're most welcome again.
Mr. Chairman and honorable commissioners of the TRC, I wish to thank you warmly for your invitation to participate in the economic crimes thematic hearing. Mr. Chairman and honorable commissioners, in order to objectively review the circumstances that led to the demise of the banking system in Liberia, it is proper to view them from the context of the economic conditions prevailing at the time. For the Liberian banking crisis of the 1990s was a result of real sector crisis in the Liberian economy. The Liberian economy began to decline in the mid-1970s, occasioned by external shocks. The increase in oil prices and the sluggish rate of economic growth in the industrialized countries adversely affected the domestic economic environment. Particularly, the demand for Liberia's then leading export iron ore declined while the cost of production, which depended on imported inputs, rose. By 1977, the recessed market conditions for iron ore led to the fall in domestic production. Prior to the fall, iron ore and natural rubber accounted for about 70% of export earnings, and 25% of gross domestic product, GDP. The unfavorable external environment resulted to balance of payment problems, which deteriorated by 1977. The trade balance was also affected as the declining surpluses had become negative by 1977. The difficulties of the late 1970s were carried into the 1980s. The coup d'etat in 1980 caused massive capital flight, brain drain, and triggered private sector disinvestment. As a result of these developments, the banking system became illiquid. To alleviate this problem, the government in 1982 minted and put into circulation the $5 coin. However, by reason of fiscal indiscipline, compounded by reduced financial management capacity, revenue fell steadily while expenditures rose sharply. The government, in response to these regressive developments, resorted to deficit financing by either printing more money or borrowing from the banking system, a situation which culminated in the inflationary spirals and emergence of an active parallel market and the collapse of the bank's clearing system. The misalignment in the legislated parity between the Liberian dollar and the US dollar occasioned the rapid development and growth of the parallel market. Political instability, coupled with poor quality of economic financial management on the part of the authorities, led to accelerated loss of confidence in the financial system and the economy as a whole. This dismal performance of the economy was continuing up to 1989, when the civil conflict started and exacerbated an already bad situation. During the civil conflict, the economy virtually collapsed, and the fiscal, economic, and social infrastructures were devastated. By the mid-1990s, Liberia had no external reserves and owed creditors over $3 billion. Shortly after the general elections in 1997, the newly elected president of Liberia, President Charles G. Taylor, on November 20, 1997, issued Executive Order Number 1/1997, creating a special presidential commission to review the entire banking sector of the Liberian economy and to make appropriate recommendations to him that, if adopted and implemented, could lead to the revival of the sector. The Special Presidential Commission was to be known as the Banking Commission, and it comprised of 11 members. In the executive order, the President indicated that he was cognizant of the fact that the banking sector of Liberia had fallen into disarray and had become dysfunctional, inefficient, and ineffective as a result of the prolonged civil conflict the country had undergone for the past 7 years. He further stated that, in his view, there could be no meaningful revival of the national economy without a fully functional banking system operating within a proper regulatory framework. He further stated that he had also realized that rapid economic growth and development can be attained only when the banking sector begins to meaningfully interact with the private and public sectors through sound and secure deposit taking, lending, and provision of ancillary services at reasonable cost in order to facilitate and encourage trade, investment, and savings. The Banking Commission completed and submitted its report to the President in April of 1998. The recommendations emanating from the Banking Commission's report have led to the enactment of a new Financial Institution Act of 1999, which provides a more strategic legal framework for regulating the establishment and operation of financial institutions, and B, the transformation of the National Bank of Liberia into a full-fledged central bank thereby empowering the institution to exercise prudential management of the financial and monetary sector. At the time the Banking Commission was established in 1997, there were 12 commercial banks in the sector and the National Bank. Of the 12 banks, only 4 were operational. 8 had closed their doors to the public when a major escalation in the general conflict took place in Monrovia on April 6, 1996, and have remained closed. 2 of the 8 closed banks are state-owned institutions. Most of the assets and collaterals of these banks were either looted, cannibalized, burnt during the civil conflict, and in some cases were taken out of the country. Furthermore, the banks were abandoned by their top executives. In my opinion, there are 3 main underlying causes for the failure of these banks, namely, 1, unfavorable macroeconomic environment, 2, the protracted 7-year civil conflict, and 3, managerial weakness in banks' operation. Unfavorable economic environment. Failure of successive governments to undertake comprehensive fiscal reform complemented by monetary reform is the root cause of the unfriendly macroeconomic environment in which Liberian commercial banks had to operate. Deficit financing had persisted over the years, caused by a bloated public sector which has continuously put financial demands on the government for which resources were not available. Deficit had been financed by minting of coins and printing of banknotes, massive borrowing by government from the National Bank and the Commercial Bank, and accumulation of arrears of unpaid credits and crowding out of private sector borrowers. The misalignment in legal terms of the Liberian dollar vis-a-vis the US dollar had led to over-evaluation of the local currency. The absence of foreign exchange, especially at the disposal of the National Bank, made it impractical to defend the official exchange rate. The maintenance of the official exchange rate of the Liberian dollar vis-a-vis the US dollar in the face of the sharp depreciation of the local currency in the parallel market placed the commercial banks in a quandary with respect to the appropriate adjustment of their charges, fees, and other incomes to reflect the rising costs occasioned by the depreciation. Most of them did not make timely adjustments and therefore incurred losses. There were also external factors which contributed to the poor macroeconomic environment. Current account imbalances, which were heavily weighed down by the huge trade deficit, did not improve. This was the origin of the foreign exchange crisis never experienced in the country before 1980. Slow judicial process regarding loan recovery is yet another problem faced by banks. The process is long and cumbersome. The approaches to financial and monetary management between the Ministry of Finance and the National Bank of Liberia were uncoordinated. This also constituted part of the destabilizing macroeconomic environment. 2, managerial weakness in banks' operation. Weaknesses in prudential banking practices were prevalent at 2 levels. At the level of the National Bank, enforcement of prudential regulations were weak. Regular examinations of banks were hampered by inadequacy of trained staff. Lapses in statutory provision led to misinterpretation and misuse. For example, using the reserve account as current account. At the level of the commercial banks, poor management practices were characterized by the following. Undercapitalization. Almost all the banks in the system had negative capital. Poor credit analysis coupled with lending without proper documentations and collaterals, existence of poor quality assets, huge non-performing loan portfolios, non-uniform, non-standard accounting practices in an environment with dual legal tender currencies, undue concentration of lending to certain sectors, groups, insiders, or shareholders. 3, the Liberian civil conflict. The civil conflict took a toll on every facet of life in the country. The banking system was no exception, as most of its facilities and assets were either destroyed in the crisis or looted by persons in search of the spoils of war. This has impacted on portfolio assets, operations, and collateral assets. The role of the National Bank, now Central Bank of Liberia, in the payment of depositors. According to the Financial Institution Act of Liberia, both the previous and the current one, in the event of a bank failure, the National Bank or Central Bank of Liberia is to seize said bank through judicial proceedings and liquidate the financial institution. The NBL or the CBL is to do the following: pay depositors the legal deposit reserves. Currently is 22% of deposit liabilities of all banks. Monetize financial instruments that might have been placed with the NBL or CBL by the institutions to go against payments to depositors. Collect loans due to financial institutions, and this payment also, the collection also goes to the payment of depositors. Other receivables, NBL or CBF, will proceed to collect some of these receivables, and these will go against payment of depositors. The change of banknotes. As stated, during the civil conflict, banks were broken into and the vaults burglarized, and the JJ banknotes that were in circulation at the time were taken away by unknown persons. It was rumored that some of the bank's notes were carried across the border of Liberia to neighboring countries. The fear that those unknown persons would later flood the Liberian market with the stolen notes, and that said stolen notes could be counterfeited and brought into the country, necessitated a change of the currency in order to prevent the destabilization of the already fragile financial system. The change was from the note commonly then referred to as JJ to the one also then commonly referred to as Liberty. The Liberty banknote was issued by the National Bank of Liberia, signed by the governor, and attested to by the Ministry of Finance, with the person then performing the duty of the minister affixing his signature to evidence attestation. The National Savings Bond Scheme. In 1981, the government of Liberia, under the rule of the People's Redemption Council, PRC, in an effort to meet civil servants' payroll, promulgated Decree number 27, instituting a scheme of national savings and for the issuance of savings bonds. Although the scheme had provision for voluntary subscription, its main emphasis was on compulsory deduction from Liberian employees' salaries in both the private and public sectors. The decree provided that interest be accrued at 5% per annum, with the first interest payment at the end of the third year and the subsequent payments at the end of each year thereafter. 30% of the principal should have been paid in year 6, 30% in year 7, and 40% in year 8. To ensure availability of funds to make interest and principal payments when due, it was stipulated that a sinking fund be established at the National Bank of Liberia with annual appropriations out of the general revenues and assets of government. Under the scheme, according to information available, the government of Liberia collected 24.1 million from 120,264 Liberian employees. National saving bond certificates were issued to the employees and the records were kept at the National Bank of Liberia. To the best of my knowledge, the sinking fund was never established and no payments were ever made to it by the government. As at 31st December 1997, accrued interest was 16.3 million, which together with the principal totaled $40.4 million. Generally, the issuance of term bonds and treasury bills by a sovereign government are the appropriate instruments for fund mobilization, and it provides opportunities for savings and investment for the public. It is also a useful mechanism for effecting monetary policies by influencing interest rates and mopping up excess liquidity from the system. However, these instruments should not be forced on the public, but should be negotiable and priced at risk-return levels in keeping with market perceptions. If the government intends to utilize these types of financial instruments in the future as a means of borrowing, then it is imperative that the government redeems the savings bonds. Even if the government is not intending to use the system of borrowing from the people in the near future, it is prudent and good governance practice that a program should be drawn up for the full redemption of the outstanding savings bonds within a relatively short period of time in order to pave the way for government to introduce more desirable market-driven instruments in the future. Mr. Chairman and Honorable Commissioners, you asked me to speak on the theme, economic crimes, acts that infringe on the rights of others as it relates to the premature closure of banks and other financial institutions, and the role of the National Bank, now Central Bank of Liberia, in the payment of deposits, the change in currency, the impact on the economy as well as the savings bond scheme, the tension and motives as well as the impact on society. In my exposition, I have attempted to the best of my ability to cover these issues raised by the theme. I must confess to you that I am not sure whether the actions, interactions, and omissions which I have tried to dissect to you may be described collectively as economic crimes. For to do so will be to conclude that the external economic forces coupled with internal factors which were mostly political in nature were of a criminal nature. I do not think so. External economic forces are totally beyond our control. The internal factors too, which were mostly political, were beyond the control of the banking system. There is no doubt, however, that all of these factors caused the Liberian populace a lot of tension. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Honorable Commissioners.
I want to thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
We would like to engage you in a brief period of questions and answers. But before that, could you kindly speak briefly to your professional background and public service portfolio?
I have a BA degree in economics from the University of Liberia in 1972, an MBA degree with emphasis on finance from the University of South Florida in 1976. I joined the Liberian Bank for Development and Investment shortly after I returned home and worked there. My first job was the position of projects analyst, and then I rose on to becoming the projects manager, and then on to the general manager and the president of the bank. I left the bank in 1986 and went into the private sector. In December of 1990, when the interim government came to Liberia, I was asked to serve as governor of the National Bank of Liberia. I was in that position up to September of 1995, and since then I've been in the private sector. I currently run a financial consultancy firm called the Magas Investment Corporation. I'm the president and CEO.
Commissioner Coleman will lead.
Thank you. Testing. Thank you very much, Mr. Vinton, for your good presentation to us. My first question has to do with this understanding of liability for loss. Here you've told us stories of how, due to circumstances maybe sometimes beyond control of any one individual, political reasons, etc., we've seen that the Liberian people's wealth has just been eroded one way or the other, whether it's through an economic crime or whether it's through the reality of the system falling apart, etc. But yet we are now in a stable government in a sense, and we have a bright future ahead of us. The wealth of this country is basically still there in the sense of the minerals under the ground, the natural resources that haven't been exploited yet, and the greatest wealth of all, the human mind and hearts of our people. So, in your opinion, shouldn't there be some linkage with the responsibility of government to secure the losses of the past? Particularly, for example, let's take a small case of the savings bonds, where you talk about $40 million worth of funds that have just evaporated. But yet those people gave their money with trust. The government is still back today. Shouldn't there be some sort of reparation in issues like this and in other areas? It doesn't have to be short-term, it could be a long-term mechanism, but yet there should be some sort of, some consequences of that past. I mean, this is my thinking, but I would like to get your opinion as a professional in this banking area.
That is a political decision that has to be taken by the government. As far as the savings bond is concerned, I know that the bonds were vetted as part of the domestic debt of the government. Now the government has to take a decision as to when it will pay the savings bond scheme to those who have the certificates.
So would that go also in line with failed banks that owe taxpayers millions of dollars and haven't been able to pay when they were guaranteed by the National Bank and Central Bank? Is there some mechanism that eventually will come into place to pay that money from future wealth that the government will generate, for example?
One of the problems of the National Bank then, which I alluded to in terms of the lapses in misinterpretation, the reserve account should have been separated from the current account. But this account was commingled, and this was one of the weaknesses in the Financial Institution Act, or the act that established the bank, or the prudential guidelines at the time. And so we found out that in most instances, this current account, which had both the reserve and the current account of the commercial bank, was in overdraft with respect to many banks. And so perhaps the National Bank should take responsibility for that. They should have insisted that the account be current at all times, or be in positive position at all times. But most of the bank's current account were completely in negatives. A few of them that had positive balances, there are still no records as to who owes what, to the depositors. There's no adequate record of the total deposits in question, and to be able to determine the 22% reserve.
Okay, so in the current situation, the lessons that we learned from all of this, do you, in your position now as a consultant, do you see the current government system haven't taken into consideration these lapses and have done something about it, or is this situation still business as usual?
No, the new
For
financial...
example, records. You talk about no record. Do they have indelible record system now that this would never happen again?
Yeah.
Like where you have a backup system in foreign countries or other things like that, not just depending on local computers that can easily be burnt or triggered and destroyed, etc.
Yeah, one of the things that the central bank now has put in place is to have a backup system of records, you know, in addition to what they have locally. They have records outside of the central bank, just in case something happens in the future, you know, and you need to go back and find out, you know, what the records are. You can always go back to those records that are not with the central bank here.
Okay, another concern is this cash issue. We hear stories of so many cases where government paid out huge sums of money to contractors and people constructing a bridge here, building a bridge there, 10 million here, 5 million there, another million here, and that during the course of this turbulent period of ours, 79 to 2003, none of these projects were implemented, and we don't even know where the cash is. It's just gone. So, I mean, has there been any research to show, was it that people were putting cash in their pocketbooks and carrying it out, or were there bank transfer, legitimate records that could be traced to foreign bank accounts to show that people did carry these funds out, public money, but yet didn't perform? I mean, how were things done during that time?
Well, if the monies were paid by the government of Liberia, definitely there are records. The central bank has record as to who the monies were paid to and how the monies were paid. Those records are available. So if anyone wants to find out exactly how these people got paid, the records are available at the Central Bank of Liberia.
Oh, but
and I think the Ministry of Finance should also have record of these payments.
Oh, but that will only be for the recent time frame, right? Because you said earlier there was no records to even justify what banks owe what, you know, and who the tax did.
A lot of the records were, you know, to the best of my knowledge, there are no records of some of these funds that were paid to people.
Okay, the other issue of cash that I'm concerned about, your opinion, this issue of two-tier system in Liberia where people have freedom to use the US dollar so quickly, is that still a good option for us today, considering how it brought a lot of drain on cash reserves? Because, for example, if there was a situation where it was purely Liberian dollars, people would have been caught in a situation of carrying out useless toilet paper because they could easily just change the currency and they will find that their wealth has no meaning. And the US now could have been kept in a foreign account by the government and therefore wouldn't have as much waste and drain as we have in the country today. But because we're using it in such an equal balance, people could have taken US dollars directly out and restart their lives in foreign countries and not have any worry. So I'm wondering is there any thought of re-examining this issue for the future Liberia now, considering the loss and damage it's caused for us? Or what is your opinion about this? Or just one of those?
When the Banking Commission report, we had recommended that we use our local currency as the legal tender. But there were divided opinions on that among some of the members of the commission. However, the authorities at the time took the political decision that we should still have the hybrid system, the dual currency system, the US dollar circulating along with the local currency. The only difference is the exchange rate. Before this time, it was legislated. You know, the Liberian dollar was equal to the Liberian dollar by law. Now, the two currencies are operating, they are legal tender in the country, but the difference between the two is the exchange rate, which is determined by market forces. Personally, I would say we should use our own local currency. This is my opinion. All right, and use the US dollar as a foreign as a foreign currency, foreign reserve. But this is a political decision. The politicians will be the one to determine that.
I understand. By the way, what year was that you said the commission, the banking commission, made that recommendation?
Yeah, the report was submitted to the president in 1998, April.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vincent, for coming, providing some light on these issues that discussed normally, for the most part, in small financial circles. Now it's come to the country. The first question I would like to ask is, what has been the impact of the dollarization of the Liberian economy? How can it be reversed? Can it, by a simple political decision, as you said, henceforth we use the national currency, and can that be done?
I think we should tread carefully in that our economy as a whole has not come to full bloom. That would be my first suggestion, until we have reached that point. I think we should continue with the status quo. All right. When we shall have seen a more productive economy, then we can come back and look at this issue. Because even though my preference is the national currency, this also has its advantages. We see here that there are no shortages in the market of goods and services. We predominantly depend on our international trade. We import more than we export. And so to be able to do that, you need foreign exchange to do that. And our economy has not developed to the point where we have the kind of reserves that will enable us, to provide this kind of service to the general economy.
So what would you say has been the adverse effects of such a situation?
Well, one of that would be that, in terms of prices, because the US dollar, the foreign exchange is really what you call the proxy for your inflation rate. This is one of the things is factored into some of the prices that we pay locally for consumer products.
Now, but in this age of globalization, will the move away from the US dollar and to a national currency, will it have make any significant difference?
It shouldn't. It shouldn't, but you should be able to defend your local currency in the event that you have some imbalances in the system. And so you need your economy has to be at that point where you earn a lot of export earnings to be able to defend the local currency.
So until that time, we have to depend on the vagaries of the movement of the exchange rate. All right. You were accepted to serve in the interim government of national unity in 1990 December, as you said. What was the liquidity of the central bank? What was in government coffers at the time you came to head the central bank? And how did it look like at the time of your departure?
At the time we took over from the National Bank, the reserves in the vault at the time were mere $6 million Liberian dollars.
3 million Liberian dollars.
Six million Liberian dollars. And then we depended mostly on the maritime revenue to be able to fund government payrolls and what have you. The change of currency because of the looting of the banks, when that happened, we were able to handle those banks that were broken into. First we did an audit of all the banks that were whose vaults were violated.
Was the central bank also affected by it?
No, the central bank was not. It wasn't affected. There was an attempt, but no, they didn't succeed. And so that was how we were able to put liquidity into the system.
And then by the time you left, had the liquidity situation improved?
By the time I left, the liquidity situation was normal. I mean, it wasn't the best, but it was normal. Because when we left, we had the government payroll was current, and there was money in the bank when we left.
Now, recently we had some witnesses appearing before this commission and attesting that in the period right up to or preceding the fall of Monrovia, or I won't say the fall of Monrovia, or the entry into Monrovia of the rebel fighting groups, was that the Doe government had frantically transferred assets, I suppose liquid assets, out of the country to Swiss banks. Did any such transfer go through the banking system, or it was done outside of the regular banking system?
Well, from records available to us at the National Bank of Liberia, we didn't see evidence of that. So it may have been done outside of the banking system.
In that light, I'd also like to ask, was there any evidence on the books when you took over of the National Bank where the amount of United States $20 million have been paid for the construction of a new structure for the bank? Was that reflected on the books?
It wasn't $20 million, it was $17 million that was paid, but a lot of that money, about 10 million of that, was issued in checks which we found, which we nullified.
But 10 million of that?
Yes.
So that means that there was 7 million outstanding which have been taken.
That's correct.
Was this paid to who?
It was paid to the contractor.
Were there any reasons provided for in the document that you came across that justify the payment of such money when the bank had not been completed?
According to records, what was paid to the contractor was confirmed by the consultant of the bank, who was the architect for the bank.
Wallace and Wallace?
Yes.
Now, you mentioned in your presentation something about uncoordinated approaches between the Ministry of Finance and Central Bank regarding government financial operations. Can you describe such a situation, and to what extent was that, and during which period was this practice or this situation most pronounced?
Basically, that was during the 80s when, I'll give you an example, the payment of government salaries. The Ministry of Finance will announce without any recourse to the central bank or the National Bank to find out if government had balances, to pay payroll. and they would just go ahead and announce, then that put pressure on the National Bank to find the money to pay.
Now, you also talked about weaknesses in the banking sector, insider lending, and all what have you. Would you say that such a situation developed and continued as a result of some remiss of duty on the part of the central bank, was not exerting enough control? And if it were, was it political decisions that contributed to such a situation, or what?
As I mentioned, that the weaknesses also were attributed to the National Bank of Liberia. There were no regular examinations done by the National Bank of these banks, and so when some of these violations were found later, there was nothing done about them by the National Bank.
Were there any reasons why? What would you say could be some of the reasons why this was? Was it the lack of political will, or maybe the bank was just turning a blind eye and moving ahead?
I think it was more like the lack of will than just turning a blind eye.
So, coming back to the National Savings Bond Scheme, although our time reference period is up to 2003, but that issue was introduced in 1981, I suppose, and it still lingers today. At the time, the Blue Ribbon was a Blue Ribbon Commission, right? That was established by President Taylor to assess the banking situation. Did that report take into account what had been paid under the National Savings Bonds scheme?
There was no payment made under the National Savings Bond scheme. There has been no payment made.
No, I mean contributors to the scheme.
No. After the administration of President Doe, the savings bond scheme ceased. All right. And so what is outstanding now it dates back to 1981 when the scheme was established. It should have been paid. The scheme should have been liquidated by 1987 or 88 thereabout. But that was not done.
And was that reflected? Up to the time you left, was that reflected as part of a domestic debt portfolio?
It's still, up to this point, it's still part of domestic debt.
What would it take, for example, to retire this? Is it the lack of money to do so, or is it maybe the absence of political will?
Well, I believe first you have to determine who all have these certificates. Some might have lost their certificates. Others might have picked up other certificates and holding them, hoping that one day the bonds will be paid. And so you have to be careful how you go about trying to redeem it. You have to be careful not to pay the wrong person, who doesn't have. Others have even to use their local partner, pawn their certificates to other people. And so they're in the hands of other people. And so all of these problems you have to really take them into consideration when you decide to pay the money.
But given that government has already identified the total number of persons that paid, and I suppose there should be some correlation to the source from which they paid, whether they were at LEC or at wherever, that they were employed Liberians. This scheme was for employed Liberians, I mean, who made compulsory payments to the scheme. And the fact that you have presented a figure of the total number of persons that paid with the identification, and as you rightly say, some are holding other certificates, some are lost. I, for instance, contributed to the scheme. I don't have my certificate today. So, if such an exercise were launched, would it present a nightmare for government to vet this a domestic debt portfolio and actually identify those who actually paid?
The figures, the dollar figures have already been vetted. I think the other issue is trying to vet legitimate holders of these certificates. That's the next problem that we have to tackle. You know, we already know how much the government owes to those who contributed to the scheme. Now, we should be able to determine of the 120,264 persons that contributed, how many of those have the certificates, how many of those are living. All of these things have to be taken into consideration before you make the payments. There's no question the dollar figures have been identified, you know.
As a side question there, let me just ask whether the debt forgiveness initiative that government has embarked on, does it include domestic debt that you're asking forgiveness for? Does it include domestic debt or only debt that owed to external creditors?
I believe the emphasis is on external debt.
I would like to ask about the National Housing and Savings Bank. I don't know whether you were here, but there was a point in time when the Housing and Savings Bank had an oil facility arrangement with the Lombardi Group, and during the time of the PRC, it reneged on the payment. The Lombardi Group withdrew, and the Red Mountain Finance Corporation, a company, I think based in Oklahoma in the U.S., provided a $50 million oil facility arrangement to the LPRC, guaranteed by the central bank or the national bank at the time. I don't know whether during your tenure, whether such came to your attention, but I do know that during the period of the crisis, this arrangement didn't come up. I mean, such discussions didn't come up until 1997, following the elections of a new government, and these people from the Red Mountain Finance Company raised the issue and proposed engagement with government to address the problem. Now, to the best of my knowledge, this was not addressed, and today the LPRC boasts of being the most viable corporation around here, most liquid. Is this the liquidity often boasted of? Is it real? Where does the 50 million contracted by LPRC through the National Housing and Savings Bank, guaranteed by the central bank, what is the state? What is the current state of that? And how come that is not reflected on the books of the LPRC, when we do know that the LPRC did enjoy an oil facility arrangement, and I've heard nothing about whether these arrangements or monies owed under this arrangement are being liquidated or not, but we hear that the LPRC in fact declared a profit and contributed money to the government. The housing bank, on the other hand, remains closed and insolvent. How do you see this situation?
That obligation has effectively been taken over by central government and is part of the arrangement with the commercial creditors.
Now, but that agreement, as you say, has been taken over by the central government. That agreement, to my recollection, was not attested to by the central bank. And at the time, I think Mr. Sirleaf was
The governor.
governor of the central bank. But instead, it was signed by other individuals from the Ministry of Finance, from LPRC. Housing Bank was not included, and the amount still remains reflected in now. If, as you say, that amount has been taken over by the central government, why is it that amount is still reflected on the books of the Housing and Savings Bank?
I wouldn't know that, but as far as I know, that that particular obligation has been taken over by the central government.
But now, as to say, what is not done legally is not done at all. I would assume that such an arrangement between the Ministry of Finance, LPRC, and the central bank would have the authoritative signature of the governor of the central bank. And the deputy ministers for expenditure at the Ministry of Finance signed that. And but there's a notable absence of the signature of the governor of the central bank. Does this is it valid despite that the governor of the central bank did not sign this arrangement?
We have moved from the practice of asking the Central Bank of Liberia to provide guarantees to state institutions or public corporations. We've moved from that stage now. Now it's either done by the corporation itself, between the corporation and whoever the creditor is, or arranged by the Ministry of Finance. The central bank doesn't participate in all of these things anymore. And that is a new arrangement now.
The other thing you mentioned in your presentation about deficit financing. To what extent that practice still exists today?
It doesn't.
It does not.
No.
The Liberia Bank for Development and Investment. I understand that the government of Liberia holds a certain percentage. What is the percentage that the government of Liberia holds? I also understand, rightly or wrongly, that all preceding presidents, including the president of that bank, do have a percentage shareholding in that bank. Is this true?
Let me answer the first question. The first question is the Liberian government has about 18% share. They and the government and the IFC have equal percentage in the bank. The Class A shareholders.
That's the International Finance Corporation?
Yeah, International Finance Corporation. The IFC, along with the government, were instrumental in the establishment of the LBDI. As regards the president of the bank, whether it is this president or previous president, that information is not correct.
Now you talk about a problem affecting the banking sector has been undercapitalization of the banks. And we saw too many times in the past, banks arose and died out not too long after, leaving depositors hanging in the air. What would you say, to what extent does such a problem exist in the current situation?
As you know, there is a reform of the financial system now, spearheaded by the Central Bank of Liberia. And as of December of 2008, all banks were required to capitalize at $6 million. By the end of this current year, all banks will be expected to capitalize at $8 million. By the end of 2010, banks will be required to have a minimum capital of $10 million. This is to avoid the kind of problem that we experienced during the 80s and the 90s, in that the capitalization, the amount required to start a financial institution then was very small. Anybody with the means could start a bank, and we don't want that happening this time around. And also, banks are now required to have institutional shareholders in addition to individual shareholders.
I see. Now,
and so I would tell you for sure that the banking system now is very, very buoyant. It's very sound. You know, it's a question of having the opportunities now, the investment opportunities, investment projects for the banks to.
so how would you compare the current regulatory framework as opposed to the past? And in your opinion, does the central bank currently has the capacity, or has its capacity been to regulate the banking sector? Is it what it should be? Optimal?
Yeah. The lapses of the previous NBL, some of the loopholes that we had in the Act and the Financial Institution Act, those have been corrected, and then there are more prudential regulations now, and regulating the banks, insisting on them being compliant with all of these prudential regulations.
Now, I know in keeping with prudent financial practices, it's the central bank or the national treasury or whatever that is responsible for the printing of notes and the minting of coins. Before I ask what happened to the coins, what has disappeared, let me just come quickly to the printing of notes. And this has been a practice which is still in evidence today. Although it's known to banking authorities that individuals do not have the capacity to print notes, except counterfeit notes, and we're not talking about that, that's illegal activity. But there is a tendency for business, houses, other individuals to reject mutilated notes. And as far as I can recall, I've seen no systematic process put into place to take away mutilated notes from the market. Instead, individuals customers holding mutilated notes are more or less penalized for holding such mutilated notes because they cannot exchange them across the counter. Why is this so?
The issue of mutilated notes, people rejecting mutilated notes, is a problem of perception. The central bank has over and over again informed the population, the public, if you have a mutilated, that these notes should be accepted, and if you need to exchange them, take them to the banks will accept them and bring them and take them to the central bank for exchange. Unless where the note is completely defaced, then it will be rejected. As long as the serial numbers are there and other landmarks on the notes are present, nobody should reject the notes. But this is a perception problem.
But this is in theory. Even if you go to the banks, because I've experienced where even the bank has refused an old note. Now, there's a problem with US dollar notes, because there's some US dollar notes that they tell you. In fact, if you went to Sierra Leone and other places, they will tell you US dollar notes issued between this period and that period will not be accepted, except the new notes. And to an extent where we have the US dollar note as legal tender, you see this practice that you even go to the bank and say there's note too old, why you bring this note? And to even get it exchanged for par value is difficult, let alone to talk about Liberian dollar notes. In theory, yes, nobody should refuse this, but in practice, it's not the case.
Commission, I mean,
And you have people going around, money tier, money tier, money tier, and you give them your money, they give you a reduced value for your money, and you cannot get it exchanged at the bank. So one wonders whether there's some activities going on where there's some vested interest, involved.
it shouldn't be. Now, let me tell you, a lot of time people don't want to waste time on trying to go to the central bank or to a commercial bank to try and exchange a mutilated $5 note, and so they rather let somebody discount it for them, but it shouldn't. Nobody is authorized to discount, mutilated monies. Take your own time, go to any bank, if possible, go to the central bank, and you'll get your note exchanged.
Well, we hope this will be reflected in current practice, but unfortunately,
It is in
I don't know
current
what
practice.
extent, especially outside the main urban centers, you're in a bind.
We have representatives of the central bank going to all of these payment centers, and I think they are authorized to receive these mutilated notes and exchange them for new notes.
Anyway, what has happened to the circulation of coins in the banking system? There was a time when I remember there was the half-cent coin, Liberian coin, 1 cent, 2 cents, 5 cents, but 10 cents, 50 cents, 25 cents, $1, but a complete absence today, and there are no explanations. Now I understand that there are some individuals holding minted coins, transforming into jewelry objects, and all of that. What would you say could be the value, total value of minted coins that should be in circulation but not in circulation? And what is the impact?
The value of coins, the cost, first of all, the cost of minting a $1 or even a 50-cent coin is far more than the value of the coin. So that's one aspect of it. And now in the market, nobody accepts anything less than $5.
And you attribute this to the dollarization of the economy? Or?
No, it's not the dollar. It has nothing to do with the dollarization. It's just, again, should I say, maybe it's a quote-unquote business perception of people, but it shouldn't be. Nobody wants any coin anymore. The central bank has attempted to put out coins, and nobody takes them. If you went into a commercial bank where they gave you, after they paid your salary and they gave you some coins, they will leave them at the counter and walk away.
But that's another problem. Since the issue of, since we have a duality of currencies, there's a problem. If, for instance, you paid $70.25 as your wage in the public sector,
Yes.
there's no accounting for the 25 cents. They give you $70, that's it. And if you look at it on an aggregate level, that's quite a tiny sum to just be put away and nobody accounts for it. How?
These are problems that it takes time to try to get around to solving, some of these
But
problems.
who benefits under this current situation? Your salary is $70.25. You go and we maybe 1,000 who are making the minimum wage, or maybe even 20,000. I don't know the size of the government payroll, but assuming just hypothetically that we are about 20,000 making $70 or $50.25, and if you multiply the 20,000 times 25 cents, that's quite a good bit. Who accounts for it? Where does it go?
The way I've seen it practice is that if, for example, your salary is $12.55, they try to round it to the next figure, maybe make it $13 or $15, or this is the practice that I've seen in most businesses. I don't know about government.
Is it prudent? Is it prudent practice?
To avoid this problem of trying to find the change point to give it to you.
There's no shortage of US dollar coins, and except in the notes. Why is it that there will not be any attempt to pay you in with coins? You went to the supermarket, you see goods denominated in US currency, and once it comes to percentages, 25 cents, 75 cents, they'll give you Liberian currency, even though you pay US currency, and you expect to get US dollar currency change in return. But there's no insufficiency of US dollar coins.
They do give you the equivalent. They do give you the equivalent in Liberian dollars. And that's because maybe they don't have,
why such a situation exists, and what can the can the central bank do about that? Would you agree that this is a problem that needs to be addressed?
It needs to be addressed. It's a problem.
Now, my last question. I'm sorry for taking this forward. It's commonly acknowledged that the informal sector contributes so much and has been the main engine of our economy. But yet, there seems to be very little attention paid to this sector. Why is this so? You would think from bankers' perspective.
That has been an age-old problem that it's talked about every day, but no solution has been found, no policy measure has been put in place to try and bring the informal sector into the formal sector.
Is it due more to the absence of policies, or the impossibility of deriving policies that will address such a situation, or is it, can you say, the lack of political will to do so?
The policies can be drawn up, but also it's a two-way street. Making the policies and making people to take advantage, those in the informal sector to take advantage of the policy. If the policy is then no one takes advantage of it, then what good is the policy? It becomes a white elephant.
Okay, my last question. Former President Taylor always used to say Monrovia is not Liberia. Meaning, in many ways, services that the ordinary person is supposed to be able to access cannot do so outside of Monrovia. And this particularly has to do with the issue of pay. And during our work, travel around the country, holding hearings, went into some places where there are government functionaries and all have you, but they have to either take 2 days or 3 days to get to where they will get to be able to get payment. And then you have the teams of the central bank going to sit at a particular location. These people have to come all the way to them. Can anything be done to address such a situation, or we leave it to the mercy of the market forces?
No, I think the central bank has put the mechanism in place where there are payment centers all over the country now, where there are no commercial banks. The bank has payment centers, as far as I know, all over the country now, as far as Grand Crew.
And touching on the weaknesses of the bank that you alluded to, the recycling of checks already paid, as we saw recently, and paying recycled checks. Would you say this is a manifestation of the kind of weaknesses you feel, although you say the banking system is very healthy today? Then I wonder, what is it that provides room for such a discrepancy?
When a criminal wants to do anything, regardless of how tight your system may be, they can always beat the system. I recall also during my time, there were, recycling of checks. The only thing is that the people know themselves. They know exactly where to take the checks and have them in cash, So it was between two institutions, the Ministry of Finance and the National Bank. And today, the same thing is happening. The Ministry of Finance, it originates from the Ministry of Finance. And then...
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For contributing to the process. On page 4 of your presentation, they talk about the role of central bank to payment of depositors. You said according to the Financial Institution Act, before and now, the central bank is supposed to make payment to depositors who have, paid some money to the bank upon closure of those banks. The central bank been living up to that? Have they been paying the depositors in instances where banks have closed down?
Yes, I can give you a few examples. There's the Luby Bank that was liquidated by the central bank. The central bank paid all depositors to the extent of that bank's reserve account with the central bank. The BCCI Bank also, when it went into liquidation, we paid the local component of the obligation here and referred all those who had US dollar deposits to the liquidators, to the external liquidators. And to the best of my knowledge, those depositors were paid. Okay. The central bank requires all banks to keep a current account and a reserve account. For each dollar you put in savings or you deposit at your bank, 22 cents of that is put in the reserve account. The reserve requirement is used both as a monetary tool and also for this kind of eventuality, so that if there's a failure, whatever is in the reserve account of that bank is what the depositors are paid. That's the limit of the central bank's obligation to the depositors.
Now, after
including whatever loans that the bank has that the central bank will collect, from the bank's debtors.
Now, after the conflict between 1997 to 1998, some banks closed down. The central bank paid the depositors their money?
Yeah, the National Bank paid some banks, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Very few questions. I want to thank you very much for enduring this situation with us. In your presentation, you gave strong justification for the printing of new notes during the IGNU regime. My first question to that is whether that decision was purely economic or it was influenced by the politics of the day.
No, politics had nothing to do with that. It was strictly an economic or financial decision.
It would be good if you can throw some light on the legality of that transaction or that action. There were some who argued by the time that the legislature at the time didn't sanction the act, and coupled with that, the minister, I think you said it was signed by the designated minister, but the minister wasn't duly accepted, or he was rejected by the national legislature, but yet he went on to sign the banknote.
The act that established the National Bank, even though I think the Constitution of Liberia gives the legislature the authority to print money, but by the act of the legislature, that power was transferred to the National Bank or to the Central Bank. It's still the same practice today, and so yes, we did it in keeping with the act that established the National Bank of Liberia. That's the first thing. At the time that we took the decision to change the money, this was many months before the person who was appointed as minister went for confirmation here, and so that decision was already taken, and the signatures were also there. The minister is not required to sign. It's just a matter of attestation because the two institutions work together. So, and this is why I carefully stated that it was attested to by the person who was heading the ministry at the time.
Thank you. I recall also there may have been controversy as to the actual amount of banknotes printed at that time. And I remember Dr. Sawyer was here, and when we got to that point, he said, well, I think David Vinton would be the best person to say. Can you say how much of the Liberian banknotes were printed at that time?
It was 300 million.
300 million.
Yes.
And associated with that also was the policy of exchanging Liberian dollars for US dollars. We heard a lot about it, that government officials at the time could just go to the central bank, you come with 100,000 Liberian dollars and you get 100,000 US dollars in exchange. Did that happen?
No. That, I must say though, that, with the exception of very small monies, like somebody needed a $50 and we used the National Bank's money, to help them change it. But to say we gave $100,000 to somebody who needed, no, we didn't do that. It was never done.
Okay, thank you.
This story was heard all over the place,
Exactly. The Rice Stabilization Fund, we heard it was a fund established to stabilize the rice market to avoid shocks and hardship in that particular sector, given the sensitive nature of rice. But today there is no clear indication as to how that fund has been utilized over the years, and even if that is happening now, it hasn't been accounted for. I think the president lately either dissolved the fund or something like that.
To the best of my knowledge, that fund was taken away many years back in the 80s. There was a rice stabilization fund, but after some time, that money was no longer there. And it's the same thing with the reforestation fund, that the FDA was required for each tree you fell, you were supposed to pay a certain amount for, as a reforestation fee. And after a while, that fund also just disappeared, in the 80s.
So the weren't funds controlled by the central bank?
No.
Possibly 25% offshore surrender.
The 25% offshore surrender was also, another troubled area. I recall the President Doe appointed a commission to look into that. I was the head of that commission, and we concluded that this was not the solution to our problem. The solution to our problem was to undergo a holistic reform program, and that's where we left it.
Lastly, can you kindly tell us who owns the LBDI?
The LBDI is owned by private, predominantly private sector people, institutional shareholders, individuals, and the government of Liberia. The government has a small percentage, about 18%. The rest of it comprises of institutional holders and, Liberian shareholders.
Did you say government shareholding is 18?
Yes.
That's very minimal. And individuals, meaning an ordinary depositor of years who choose to invest.
Right. Yeah. We have a Liberian group, a Liberian shareholder group, and then we have institutional shareholders like the IFC, IB, and few other new shareholders. The old shareholders during my time were Undermines, LAMCO, the Bank of Liberia, ITC, and then there were German shareholders, Citibank also, So these are all the institutional shareholders. There were a German shareholding group, a French, institution shareholding group as well. So it's predominantly a private institution, even though it was established through the instrumentality of the government of Liberia.
And I shouldn't have any cause to be suspicious that authorities of the bank will be major shareholders in the bank. Nothing like that. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, Honorable David Vinton, we want to thank you very much for coming and spending this interesting moment with us. You provided us a clear understanding of how our banking sector operates and how the economy has been affected by actions, regulations, deregulations, honor regulations of the bank, and that our situation is more buoyant than what it used to be maybe 20 years ago. We want to thank you very much for coming, and please be assured that you have added a lot of value to our work. Before you leave, if there's a last word you want to leave with the Commission, the people of Liberia, you may please say so.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope I was able to provide whatever information that, or clarifications on issues that you needed. I'm also pleased that you were able to make some clarification regarding people appearance, because as soon as they hear you TRC, then you have committed a crime. But that clarification was very timely, and we would like to thank you for that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, sir. Thank you very much.